As a general rule, aircraft have certain recognisable parts: a fuselage, tail surfaces that provide control and stability, and of course, wings. But that parts list doesn't really describe the aircraft that we're going to look at today. This usually flies at night, where nobody can really see it anyway, but even to those that can get a glimpse of it, it barely looks like an aircraft at all. Just a dark, angular silhouette of a wing slicing through the air. This is the B-2 Spirit, a stealth bomber, and by the traditional rules of aerodynamics, it shouldn't really work. It cost the American taxpayer around $1 billion per aircraft, and by the time it entered service, its primary mission was gone. But those aren't the most interesting facts about the B-2. That's because if you strip away the mystique of the classified stealth technology and look past the B-2's mission as part of America's nuclear triad, and you look at it simply as a flying machine, then what you have is something almost as unsettling. A flying wing that is fundamentally unstable. This is an aircraft that does not naturally want to fly straight and level, and that would effectively be impossible for a human being to control directly. Left to itself, it would rapidly pitch, roll and yaw uncontrollably. And yet, the B-2 flies smoothly and predictably, crossing oceans and continents with ease. And the reason it can do all of that is because something else has taken over the job of flying. Every second the B-2 is airborne, computers are making thousands of tiny corrections, adjusting control surfaces faster and more precisely than any pilot ever could. They're not so much assisting the pilots, but more quietly flying the aircraft for them. Now, the B-2 Spirit is not the first aircraft to ever need computers to stay in the air, but unlike fighters that need computers in order to be extra agile, this design needs its computers in order for its fundamental concept, and specifically its shape, to work at all. So, to understand why the B-2 looks the way it does, you have to go back to the problem it was built to solve: survivability. There were plenty of planes in the US inventory that were faster or bigger or flew further, but by the late stages of the Cold War, the United States had already learned a hard lesson about modern air defences. Simply flying faster and higher didn't guarantee safety anymore. Surface-to-air missiles had grown longer ranged and more precise, radar networks had become denser and more interconnected, and interceptor aircraft could be guided toward targets long before they were ever seen visually. The era where a bomber could simply power its way through hostile airspace had come to an end. So the answer wasn't to build a faster bomber or a higher flying one, it was to build one that didn't look like a bomber at all, at least not on radar. And it was that shift in thinking that gave rise to the B-2 Spirit. Its primary mission was always strategic: the ability to penetrate the most heavily defended airspace on Earth and deliver nuclear weapons if deterrence ever failed. And that's why the B-2 forms one leg of America's nuclear triad, alongside land-based ballistic missiles and submarine-launched weapons. The other two legs, the missiles, have their advantages, mainly that they can reach their targets faster, and for a while it seemed that they could replace bombers completely. But unlike missiles, the bomber is more flexible, which means that it can be recalled, redirected or retasked even after launch. Stealth then wasn't simply a bonus or an extra feature, it's the entire point. It's what makes this aircraft possible in the first place, and of course when we say stealth, we mean stealth from radar. So here we have to talk a bit about what that means. At its simplest form, what we call primary radar works by sending out a pulse of radio energy and then effectively listening for whatever comes back. When that energy strikes an aircraft, some of it is reflected back towards the radar antenna, and from the time it takes to return, the system can determine range, direction, size and movement. On top of that, we have something called secondary surveillance radar that commercial air traffic controllers rely on to provide data on the specific radar returns, and this works by relying on signals that our aircraft transmit to the ground, which gives controllers much more information about our specific flight, such as aircraft type, speed, heading and so on, and all of which only applies when aircraft and their crews want to be seen, which is why we won't really be talking more about secondary radars in this video. But when it comes to primary radar and not being seen by it, the problem for aircraft designers is that radar doesn't see airplanes so much as shapes, but rather as collections of edges, angles, and cavities. Vertical tails, winglets, flat surfaces, right angles, and even the exposed fan blades of a jet engine all act like mirrors, reflecting energy straight back to the source. The stronger and more consistent those reflections are, the easier an aircraft is to detect, track, and target. The larger the return is, the larger the radar cross-section, or RCS. Reducing radar visibility then, or making the RCS smaller, is all about shaping the aircraft so that incoming energy is scattered away in every direction except back towards the radar that sent it. That meant that radar cross-section drove every major design decision, from the smooth, continuous curves of the wing to the complete absence of vertical surfaces that often reflect plenty of the energy back towards the radar receiver. It also meant that every aspect of the plane and its behaviour were designed to be invisible to every sensor, not just radar. Engines, for example, were buried deep within the wing to shield their hot exhaust and spinning compressor blades. The plane's own radar and radios were designed so that they will send out signals only when absolutely needed. Even the aircraft's flight profile, smooth turns, gentle manoeuvres, minimal control surface deflection, was shaped by the need to remain as invisible as possible. Interestingly, the B-2's older sister, the F-117, is also shaped to send energy away from the radar that emitted it. But this older design looks the way it does because even the best computers in the 1970s still didn't have the necessary power to process more complex, curved shapes, only a small number of flat ones. So, when prioritising stealthability for an aircraft to reduce radar returns, designers and engineers had to rethink the shapes that had evolved through aerodynamics over decades of aviation history. The B-2 didn't look the way it did because of efficiency or elegance, it looked the way it did because radar physics demanded it. And the demand to eliminate tails, fins and sharp edges pushed designers directly into a configuration that aeronautical engineers had known for generations was deeply problematic: a pure flying wing. Now these could be both incredibly efficient and incredibly stealthy, but it could also be impossible to control. And we're going to dive into why that is after this. Ever buy something online and suddenly your inbox is absolute chaos? Not just emails from the company you bought them from, but from like 50 other companies you've never heard of. Well, that's because there's a whole industry built on buying and selling your data. Fun, right? So to protect myself, I use today's sponsor, Incogni. Now, instead of getting hundreds of spam calls per year and an inbox full of rubbish, I get barely any, and my digital life feels so much calmer. Here's how it works. The second you complete any online purchase, your information hits the market. Your address, phone number, email, all of it. Data brokers then buy it and sell it to literally anyone willing to pay. Marketers, scammers, hackers, you name it. But Incogni tracks these data brokers down before they can do that. They then force them to delete your information so it can't fall into the wrong hands. And the best part, well, you don't have to lift a finger. Just give them your information and they'll start scouring the internet, demanding that your data gets scrubbed from every sketchy corner. Incogni now has this custom removals feature too. If you find a specific site selling your information, just paste that link into your dashboard and their team will deal with it for you. Grab it now for 60% off at incogni.com/mentor now with the code mentor now or by scanning this QR code. Thanks Incogni for supporting the channel. Now, let's get back to the video. So, let's look at flying wings, their control issues, and why many aerodynamicists have been obsessed with them for decades. From very early on in aviation's history, aircraft designers had known that a flying wing could be extraordinarily efficient. In normal aircraft, the fuselage isn't providing much lift at all, and it's generating a good bit of drag. Likewise, the tail surfaces add stability, but they do this by adding even more drag, and they even cancel out some portion of the wing's lift. But in a flying wing, by eliminating the traditional fuselage and tail, the entire aircraft becomes a lifting surface, producing less drag for a given amount of lift and wasting far less energy pushing unnecessary structure through the air. So on paper at least, a flying wing looks like the logical endpoint of aerodynamic evolution. It's lighter, cleaner, and more efficient than traditional tube and wing layout because no element of it is wasted. So what's the catch? Well, in a word, stability. Basically, the traditional aircraft design, whether it's a bomber or an airliner, is a compromise between lift, drag and stability. And with airliners in particular, we really want our aircraft to be stable, and so does the FAA and other regulators around the world. But why? Well, first it's important to explore what we actually mean by stability. In aerodynamics, we refer to something called static stability, and there's 3 levels of static stability that an aircraft can possess: positive static stability, neutral static stability, and negative static stability. To understand this better, let's look at an aircraft that's flying straight and level in unaccelerated flight. If we apply a force to that aircraft, let's say some turbulence, that causes the aircraft to pitch up, say 5 degrees, and the pilot does nothing to correct for this disturbance, the aircraft will respond in one of 3 ways. Firstly, if that aircraft naturally pitches back down and returns to the original pitch attitude, the aircraft is said to be statically stable. The best way of visualizing is thinking of a small ball in the bottom of a bowl. If you push that ball away, it will naturally roll back and return to the bottom of the bowl. That's static stability. However, if the aircraft pitches up but remains at the new pitch attitude, then the aircraft is said to be statically neutrally stable. Think of a ball now, but this time on a flat surface. If you push that ball away, it'll roll away from its original position and then come to a stop. That's neutral stability. Lastly, if the aircraft continued to pitch up further and further away from straight and level after being disturbed, the aircraft is said to have negative static stability. Think of that same ball, but this time placed on top of an upside down bowl. If you push the ball away, it rolls down the side of the bowl and continues to move further away from its starting point until something stops it. And that's negative stability. So the more stable the aircraft is, the easier and more forgiving it is to fly. However, stability is at the opposite end of the spectrum to maneuverability. The less stable an aircraft is, the more maneuverable it becomes, which is exactly why fighter aircraft are deliberately designed to be statically unstable. So unstable, in fact, that these aircraft just wouldn't be flyable without complex flight control systems. So, going back to more regular aircraft design, the tail plays a big part in its ability to remain stable. The horizontal stabilizer resists unwanted changes in pitch, while a vertical stabilizer damps out yaw and keeps the aircraft pointed into the airflow. And it's this stability that makes aircraft forgiving, predictable and manageable by a human pilot using relatively simple controls. But a flying wing gives up pretty much all of that. Without a tail, there's nothing inherently keeping the nose from pitching up or down, or to keep the aircraft from yawing left or right off its intended heading. In fact, flying wing designs, like fighter aircraft, are inherently unstable. Left unchecked, the aircraft will quickly depart from controlled flight altogether. Imagine throwing a dart backwards. And all of this is old knowledge. Northrop, the maker of the B-2, had already tried to make flying wings work back in the 1940s with aircraft like the YB-49, and the results were mixed at best. And the goal back then was efficiency, not stealth. But those aircraft demanded constant attention from the pilot. They had really poor handling at low speeds and could become uncontrollable with very little warning. And it was one crash back in June of 1948, attributed in part to stability issues, effectively ended serious flying wing development for decades. For most of aviation history, that trade-off was simply unacceptable. Efficiency was nice, but stability was non-negotiable. Ultimately, an aircraft had to be something a human being could actually fly. There was simply no way around that. Well, not in the 1940s anyway. But all of that would change. Not because of new aerodynamics, but thanks to computing power. Research done for the Apollo program led to the development of guidance computers for the lunar module and the lunar lander training vehicle, which was the first ever flying machine made possible by fly-by-wire. That meant that by the time the B-2 Spirit was being designed, engineers finally had the tools to actively manage instability rather than having to design it out. Instead of shaping the aircraft to make it behave, they could shape it for stealth and efficiency and then use computers to force it to behave anyway. These improvements showed that flying wings was never impossible, in theory. It just needed a pilot that never got tired, never blinked, and could make thousands of corrections every second without anyone ever noticing. And that's why the B-2 is fully fly-by-wire, with no direct mechanical connection between the pilot and the control surfaces. Every input the pilot makes is interpreted by flight control computers, which decide by how and how much each surface should move. And more importantly, those same computers are constantly issuing commands even when the pilot isn't touching the controls at all, counteracting the aircraft's natural instability in pitch, roll and yaw. The challenge of making this aircraft fly is made even harder by the fact that the B-2 has none of the conventional control surfaces that designers normally rely on. There's no conventional elevator because there's no horizontal stabilizer, and there's no rudder because, well, there's no vertical tail. Again, the B-2 isn't the first aerodynamically unstable aircraft to use fly-by-wire, but it is, as far as we know, the first aircraft to use no kind of vertical surface to control it in yaw. But let us know in the comments if you can think of a design that preceded it, and while you're down there, don't forget to like and subscribe. Anyway, instead of a conventional tail, the B-2 uses a complex combinations of elevons, split drag rudders, and spoilers spread across the trailing edge of the wing. Each of those surfaces serves multiple purposes at once, often changing roles from one moment to another depending on the airspeed, angle of attack, and mission phase. Yaw control, for example, is achieved not by deflecting the rudder into the airflow, but by opening drag panels on one wingtip more than the other, deliberately creating asymmetrical drag. And pitch and roll are managed in a similar way, through subtle, coordinated deflections of multiple surfaces, often in ways that would be imperceptible to an observer on the ground. And all of this happens continuously, with the computers blending stability corrections and pilot commands into a single seamless response. And stealth actually places additional constraints on top of all of this. Large sudden control surface movements don't just affect handling, they can also increase radar visibility. So the flight control system isn't just keeping the aircraft stable, it's also actively limiting how aggressively the airplane is allowed to maneuver, especially during the critical parts of a mission. Its turns are smooth, pitch changes are restrained, and the aircraft is encouraged to fly in a way that preserves both control and invisibility. From the cockpit, of course, it's a non-event. Pilots describe the B-2 as calm and predictable, despite the fact that underneath the software, it's one of the most unstable aircraft ever to fly. And that dependence on automation works really well, right up to the point where it doesn't. And that moment came on the morning of February the 23rd, 2008 on the island of Guam. A B-2 was preparing to depart from Andersen Air Force Base on what was supposed to be a routine training sortie. The aircraft was fully mission capable, the crew were experienced, and there was nothing outwardly unusual about the jet as it taxied onto the runway for departure. But unbeknown to the crew, inside several of the aircraft's air data sensors, moisture had condensed during the humid tropical night. Now, those sensors feed the flight control computers some of the most basic but vital information the airplane relies on: airspeed, altitude, attitude. And that morning, 3 out of those 12 sensors were lying. And here it's important to note that the B-2 doesn't have conventional pitot tubes to measure airspeed. Instead, it relies on stealthier but more complex pitot-static sensing plates. Now, as the B-2 accelerated down the runway, the computers believed that the aircraft was moving faster than it actually was, and that its nose had a lower pitch attitude than what it actually had. And to the flight control system, that combination looked dangerous. So it did exactly what it had been designed to do. The moment the aircraft lifted off, the computers commanded a sharp nose-up correction to protect what they thought was an unsafe attitude. The result was immediate and violent. The B-2 rapidly pitched up, far more aggressively than the crew expected, and at an airspeed far too low to sustain flight. Within seconds, the aircraft stalled, the left wing dropped, and the jet rolled, and there was no time or altitude to recover. The pilots ejected as the bomber fell back towards the runway, striking the ground and erupting into flames just moments after liftoff. Thankfully, both pilots survived, one of them with some minor injuries, but the aircraft, well, that was destroyed. And since it was valued at around $1.4 billion as a materials loss, this was the most expensive air crash ever. And to add insult to injury, the investigators found that technically nothing on the aircraft had actually failed in the way that we usually think of failures. The moisture that had caused the faulty readings could have simply been eliminated by heating the sensors before flight. And this was a step that was known informally among the crews, but wasn't an official procedure at the time. However, this was corrected along with more safeguards being added to the system. But the deeper lesson was harder to ignore. In a failure like this, there is no gradual loss of control. There is no margin where a pilot can identify the problem and sort it out. An unstable aircraft like this lives or dies by the quality of the information its computers receive. Bad information has immediate consequences. The Guam crash didn't expose a flaw in the idea of fly-by-wire in general, but it was a warning on how we should think about redundant flight control systems in various failure scenarios. So, does this mean that we could see flying wing airliners in the future after we apply these lessons to them? Well, not exactly. Regulators demand that transport category aircraft must be aerodynamically statically stable. But experience with fly-by-wire, with such extreme designs as the B-2, could open up the road to other designs like blended wing bodies, which we've talked about before here on the Mentour Now channel. At first glance, a blended wing body looks like a compromise between a traditional aeroplane and a pure flying wing. Instead of a long cylindrical fuselage with wings bolted onto the sides, the body itself becomes part of the wing. Lift is generated not just by two discrete wings, but by almost the entire aircraft. And structurally and aerodynamically, it's a far more efficient way to fly. And crucially, the shape and longer profile of a blended wing body means that it can be aerodynamically stable in pitch, and since visibility on radar isn't a concern, it can also have vertical tails to stabilize it in yaw as well. Same for conventional air data sensors. So it's the best of both worlds. More of the plane is producing lift, drag is reduced, and so is the fuel burn. There are some practical limitations to the design, and we do go through those in our previous video. But if it can be done, this would be a step change in terms of efficiency that doesn't just rely on a new engine as it normally does. Again, this is far from easy, but aircraft like the B-2 and decades of experience with other fly-by-wire aircraft, their control laws and redundancy requirements mean that if such a design actually goes into production, engineers and regulators will know how to make it fly safely. In the military world, the B-2 already has a successor in the form of Northrop's B-21. And if a blended wing body enters service too, then the shape of the B-2 will be less of an oddity of the Cold War and more like a preview of the future. But what do you think? Would you like to fly in a blended wing body airliner? Let us know in the comments below. I'm Ben Watts, you're watching Mentour Now. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you next time.